Hello, this is Dishha Bagchi for ThePrint, and we're back with Lieutenant General H.S. Panag to discuss his column from this week. Modi's legacy is on the line now. We must shed passive approach to China's border dominance. Welcome back, General. Thank you for being here.
Disha, it's always a pleasure to discuss my column with you.
Right. So, in this week's column, we return to a topic that we've discussed widely and it's also quite significant, which is India China ties, as well as the unresolved border situation. So, to begin with, could you talk to us a little bit about what has been China's strategy towards India, especially since the 1950s, and how do you think it's changed given the shifting geopolitics in the region with India's ties towards the US and so on?
See, I begin the column by saying that the irony is hard to miss. China-India economic relations are thriving. Troops are massed on the border, and the situation remains tense there. And there's little or no diplomacy taking place. There has been no diplomatic contact between the two countries, especially at the highest level, except for the brief meetings that were held. And whatever little overtures we made to settle the border, current crisis, were actually snubbed by China, as we discussed earlier in one of my columns. Now, China's strategy against India is based on the premise that China does not consider India as an equal. It considers India as an inferior power. And only it feels that India is a potential economic and military competitor. Now, this has been analyzed in detail by Mr. Gokhale, who was our erstwhile foreign secretary, writing for the Carnegie Foundation. He has written this in a seminal paper where he traces out the history of China-India border relations. So, what has China's strategy been there against India? It is to exploit the economic and military differential, which has been there right from the very beginning, and the terrain advantage it enjoys on the borders, to assert its hegemony on India and coerce India for a settlement of the border dispute on Chinese terms. And in so doing, if force is required to be used, it uses force. Now, so long as China's position in the international arena is not challenged by India, and more directly, it is not challenged on the borders, good relations have prevailed. And this was so, from 54 to 59. But during this period also, though Prime Minister Nehru, seeing India's economy, had relied upon diplomacy more and less upon any kind of posing any kind of military threat as far as the borders are concerned, but India's standing in the international arena was well beyond its comprehensive national power. This was primarily due to Prime Minister Nehru's personality, who had emerged as a world leader. And then, in order to assert our claim over the frontier regions of Ladakh and as well as Northeast, Prime Minister Nehru started the forward policy. This led to clashes in 1959. Now, this was the time when stage was set for negotiations, but Prime Minister Nehru, being a very popular leader and though he had a vast majority, but he came under the pressure of Parliament. I mean, Mr. Bajpai was one of his main critics in that era, a little later, and public pressure the public image of India subjugated for last 1,000 years by foreign invaders, and now again somebody was usurping our territory. And the prime minister, actually blundered into a war with an ill-prepared army and without any border infrastructure to sustain it. Now, this was 1962 war. Now, having said this, the Chinese position on the border, despite defeating India in 1962, has been consistent. In the Ladakh sector, it considers the 1959 claim line as its LAC, or as possibly as the border in future if ever settlement takes place. And in the northeast, while it claims all of Arunachal Pradesh, but it agrees to maintain the McMahon line as the LAC, the line of actual control. So in Ladakh, 59 claim line, here McMahon line. But the McMahon line's perception differs. It is due to the problems of marking at the time of the Shimla conference in 1914. So there's a slight difference in perceptions. But despite the 62 war, this has been the Chinese position. In fact, in 59-60, Zhou Enlai, then Prime Minister of China, had offered a kind of a settlement along these lines, that we recognize McMahon line and 59 claim line will become the border in Ladakh. And this kind of a position remained open till about nearly up to I think 2005. Thereafter, China felt that India's stand is belligerent and it pulled back. Now, after the war, there was a general, freezing of relationship, but it again opened up after the Sundrangchu incident in 1986-87, where India met China on equal terms. We went in for the forward posture, and Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited China. So then the relations were on the mend, and thereafter the relations remained good till 2008. No problems. But again in 2008, two things happened. One was that in 2007, the then UPA government had formulated a policy to make border roads, and we started developing the road to Daulat Begoldi, which is the DBO road. And also our strategic partnership with the United States started emerging. So this again, was posing, China again perceived it as a challenge. And the first signal of this came in 2013 with the Depsang intrusion, when they intruded in Depsang and remained there for 1 month. So this has been the Chinese strategy, and this is what Prime Minister Modi was confronting when he took over.
Right. So now that you mentioned Prime Minister Modi, talk to us a little bit about how the Modi government has approached China, and what has its strategy been towards China since 2014, and how has it been different from previous governments and prime ministers and their perception of China?
See, ideologically, the Bharatiya Janata Party is steeped in nationalism. And regaining our territories which are under the illegal occupation of China and as well as Pakistan is one of the goals of BJP's, policy, its ideology. Now, however, when Prime Minister Modi took over, he also understood, like Prime Minister Nehru, that India requires time to catch up with China economically and militarily. So consequently, his strategy was to rely upon diplomacy, catch up with China economically and militarily, and then challenge China, after 2 decades or so, to get the settlement of the border on our terms, on India's terms. This was a very sound policy. But what happened is that, in tune with his strongman image, in tune with his ideology, he also started developing the border infrastructure, which he has been criticizing the previous government for not developing. And great impetus was given to the border infrastructure. So one hand, diplomacy was continuing. He met, he engaged with Prime Minister Xi 18 times before 2020, and thereafter also engaged with him twice, though very briefly. And economic relations were thriving in the first 3 years of Prime Minister Modi. Now, one side, he started developing the border infrastructure, and we started building roads in sensitive areas, which, as per China's perception, are across the 59 claim line. That is its border position, since the very beginning in Ladakh. So, especially in Depsang Plains, in Galwan Valley, in patrolling points 15, 16, 17, 17 Alpha in the Kugrang River Valley, in Changchenmo sector, and north of Pengong Tso, and also south of Damchok. Now, these areas, China was very sensitive. Now, so it had got alarmed, and plus, Prime Minister has taken the relationship, the strategic partnership with the United States forward, and in fact, in a more meaningful manner than in the past, in a more concrete manner than in the past. Now, this was again perceived as a challenge by China. Now, it began by, at the very time of President Xi's visit to India in 2014, it created the Chumar incident. And so it while they were still meeting, at the same time, this incident and the standoff was taking place at Chumar. Anyway, after that, there was general diplomacy continued, and Prime Minister Modi visited China, and after the reciprocal visit. But then there was an error of judgment. Now, Chinese had come into Bhutan, Doklam, to build a road, and this road was in existence for quite some time, but now they came to make it tarmac and make it properly up to Zompheri Ridge. Now, Bhutan, as it is the news, is actually acquiescing to China. It wants to settle the borders so that it can maintain peace and probably get more aid from China. In fact, that's a kind of a diplomatic challenge for India also. Now, I would say that this was an error of judgment, and rather impulsively, Prime Minister Modi intervened in Doklam, and we confronted China. So the 73-day standoff continued. Partial mobilization of troops took place, and China finally, it was agreed to after 73 days to defuse the crisis. But China was visibly embarrassed because it had lost face. It had lost face with Bhutan. And internationally, that India has stopped it from building roads, and its assertive position on the border was being challenged again. And though Prime Minister Modi tried to mend the fences by having two informal summits, Wuhan and Mahabalipuram, in Tamil Nadu, but I record there to say that power flows from the barrel of the gun, and China decided to precipitate a crisis in 2020. Now, we will not go into the details of the crisis because it's well known that China is in control of 1,000 square kilometers. Now, what the point I have made is that while Prime Minister Modi's strategy after the crisis developed was very sound, unlike Nehru, he did not blunder into a war from a position of disadvantage. Now, this was I would say, his best moment. But having done this, militarily, there was a requirement for us to be more assertive. Our military strategy was I would say that it was flawed. It allowed China to seize the initiative. Our half-hearted attempt at a quid pro quo in Kailash range was frittered away during negotiations. While militarily we can say that it's a stalemate because neither side can do much, neither side wants to escalate, but it's advantage China. China can trigger an incident anytime, as it did last year, in the Tawang sector, which we discussed in one of our earlier columns also. So I would say that the military strategy was flawed. Much more could have been done, as I discuss in the next question. Much more could have been done by us. We should have been more aggressive, and because if it had the situation had been correctly assessed, the way was open for us to do quid pro quo in a more, I would say, aggressive manner, and in a larger kind of a thing. Like instead of Kailash range, we should have taken the Kailash range further, another 50 kilometers to the southeast, which was also not held, and it is also in our territory. So there were many options which were not exercised. So this is what was, in a nutshell, was Prime Minister Modi's strategy.
Right. So, one of the main arguments you make within your column is that India must now shed its passivity and preempt China militarily. So, how do you think India can achieve this?
You see, there's much talk of China's military and economic differential with India. There is no doubt about it. China's comprehensive national power, which is a kind of a calculator of sum of all the power of the nation, hard, soft, economic, diplomatic, and others, is 1.8 times that of India. Its economy is 5 times that of India. We are just about hitting, at about 3.7, $3.8 trillion. China is close to $18 trillion. And its defense budget is 3 times ours. But there's one factor which should have been obvious if a proper strategic review had been carried out and a proper, military appreciation had been carried out, was that nuclear power states, India is a nuclear power, like Pakistan, has stalemated us. It has safeguarded itself from a major war, despite our superiority, because of nuclear brinkmanship. It's a classic example. So nuclear weapon states do not fight full-scale wars. Now, if you play brinkmanship, even the probability of the limited war remains very low with a nuclear power state. So now, below the threshold of nuclear, nuclear threshold, it's all tactical actions. And at that level, especially in the mountains, the military differential doesn't play a big part. And in this kind of conflict that will rage there, India Army can, meet China on equal terms. And if anything adverse also happens, China gets a bloody nose. Because beyond that, we are safeguarded by our nuclear weapons, and we cannot lose substantial territory, and we cannot be decisively defeated. So any risk that is there can be, warded off with the nuclear brinkmanship. And so this is something that was well known in 2020 also. Now, if we had known this, then we should have been more aggressive. China's capabilities to escalate the situation were again limited because of nuclear weapons. It could not launch anything major than this. And with the way the forces were arrayed, we were at one time superior to what China had deployed. We could have done quid pro quo actions more aggressively. My point is, now the initiative rests with China. It does things whenever they want, and we have remained passive so far. So we should no longer remain passive, and should anything happen with this premise, fighting below nuclear threshold, then we should be meeting China more aggressively and do what it did to us if required. Now, to do this, I make 2 points. One is at the macro level, that because we did not have a national security strategy, a formal national security strategy. Our response to the Chinese the crisis was knee-jerk, and it eventually became timid, because from the national security strategy flows a meaningful military strategy. Now, had we had this, then it would have been clear that these were our options which were available to us, which we didn't exercise at that time. Now, so we need to sort of give out our national security strategy so that adversaries know what to expect once they try to challenge us, and then a national defense policy to transform the armed forces. After 1962, despite our poor economic conditions, despite being defeated, in 3 years' time, the transformation of the Indian Army was well on way. Prime Minister Nehru appointed his best politician as the Mr. Chavan, YP Chavan from Maharashtra. He was the Prime Minister there as the Defense Minister. And the army in 3 years, performed very creditably and got the better of Pakistan. And the transformation continued. In 9 years, we won the most spectacular victory in the history of India. For the last 1,000 years, that's creation of Bangladesh and defeating Pakistan in totality. So this has been, again, one of the failures of Prime Minister Modi, that despite what he said, he had 10 years, so far, he may get more, from 14 to 24, which is round the corner, Indian Army could have been transformed, and it has not transformed. So that's what I recommend. And last but not the least, I recommend that we must have a bold operational strategy. Firstly, we must not leave vacant areas on the LAC. We must put more ITBP posts and man the ITBP, and maintain an adequate posture to cater for any Chinese mischief. And secondly, we must define our red lines. Our LAC, where we are, should be our red lines, and there should be no ifs and buts about it. This is our red line. You cross this, it's war, and we will take appropriate military action. Not war. I have used the macro term. You cross this, we will be free to take appropriate military action. It's our right. It's our international right. It's our national right on our borders. So, and then take action as I have recommended, boldly. And keep the threshold escalating ladder in mind, and Indian Army can achieve this. I have absolutely no doubts about it. But all this that I have said requires a political will to challenge China. And given the conditions, we can challenge it, but the political will is required. And I have no doubts that in future, the political will also be there, and India will challenge her.
Right. Well, thank you so much, General. I think you brought up some fascinating insights into, firstly, understanding China's perception and strategies towards India, how India's strategies from the Nehru era to now the Modi government, how it's changed. And lastly, also looking at what India can do to act more actively rather than passively and preempt China regarding the border situation. So for viewers interested in reading the full article by General Panag, the link to it will be in our description. Thank you, and we will see you next week.
Thank you, Disha.